Welcome, everybody. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. Happy mud season. For me, this gathering is one of the highlights of the year. I always look forward to the conference's amazing mix of people and organizations. And I draw energy and inspiration from the talent, dedication, and camaraderie that's so evident, whether it's in the wonderful talks, the panel discussions, or the posters. So thank you for being here and for making this such an exciting event. I also want to thank all of the staff, the volunteers, and the sponsors who make this conference possible, as well as the conference steering committee. I'm especially grateful to my extraordinary colleagues Ruth Halsworth and Carol Hamill. It's now my pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker, Aram Calhoun. Aram's a professor in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology, and is a fellow as well in the Mitchell Center. There's already a lot of good information about Aram in your program, so I want to point to a couple of the things that aren't so obvious. If you look on the slide for a second, I want to encourage you to read what I think of as a wonderful 3-page story about Aram's life and work that appeared about 18 months ago in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, Science. So you can find this article just by Googling the title, Googling resources, and Aram Calhoun, and it'll take you, there's a spot on the University of Maine website where you can get a free version of this. As many of you may know, very few scientists ever manage to publish a paper in this prestigious journal, but far fewer are actually profiled there. So let me read to you the first paragraph of this paper, because it tells you a lot about Aram. As a kid growing up in rural Rhode Island, Aram Calhoun ran the frog patrol. When she caught neighborhood boys throwing frogs into traffic, she chased the offenders and beat them up. Then she persuaded her adversaries to become allies. Quote, I recruited 2 of the worst ones to my team, the ecologist recalls. We'd go find frogs and save them. Well, the story goes on, and it's a wonderful story, and I know Aram well enough to know that it's a true story. And what it talks about is a remarkable passion and persistence, a commitment to bringing together diverse groups, listening to all sides, treating everyone with respect, and searching for common ground. To my knowledge, she hardly ever beats anyone up anymore. But this time yesterday, I wasn't even sure I would have the opportunity to introduce her on. She called me to say she was so sick, she doubted she could give the keynote address. True story. Her voice was so raspy and weak, I wasn't even sure it was Aram. I told her how sorry I was and that I couldn't imagine how we'd pull this off if she couldn't be here. But after a moment, I thought, well, I asked her if maybe I could give her a talk in her place. And the next thing I knew, as I listened carefully, her voice strengthened a little bit, became a little bit clearer. She said she thought she was actually beginning to feel just slightly better. And eventually that she was confident that she'd be able to give the address after all. Ever since then, I've been wondering if she experienced some kind of miraculous recovery, or that the thought of me totally mangling her talk caused her to soldier on and come here no matter how lousy she felt. Either way, please join me in welcoming Professor Aram Calhoun.
Can folks in the back hear me? Yes, good, great. David, thank you for that introduction. and I'm feeling so much better. I'm very excited to be able to speak with you folks today. I'm going to be talking about conserving vulnerable wetlands, vulnerable waters. Not just talking about locals today, some of you may have thought. But before, I actually want to get back at David. Before I continue, I would really like to thank and acknowledge the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, Sustainability Science, for so many things. And I wanted to say some things about it, and I thought, well, I'm probably not articulate enough to put an extemporaneous paragraph together, so I did word association, said, Aram, what do you think of when you think of the center? And actually, these are the words that came to mind for me. I've worked with David's group for over 10 years now. Optimism. It's always a cheerful, can-do place to work. The other thing that came to mind was diversity of issues and people is celebrated there and fostered there. Solutions-driven. We're not just creating science that floats away in dusty journals that nobody reads. I really appreciate that work. I've been practical all my life. Beating up children actually is true. And I don't think that was a respectful way of handling it, but I did do that. Science, do people remember that word? Begins with S, ends in E, science. Science is celebrated at the Mitchell Center. And I really appreciate that they boost careers. They are so graduate student and young faculty oriented and help those people get funding and to move forward with science that matters to people. And since November, these things that I've listed right here have become critical for me for carrying on in my work. So, a keynote. I thought I'd give you the keynote in one paragraph in case you get hungry and walk away, you'll know what my message was, and I'm going to give you the keynote first. That is that we must conserve vulnerable water resources through local, collaborative initiatives that support livelihoods of all biota, humans, microorganisms, what have you. And it sort of matches a very sad statement by an anonymous but upset EPA employee. We are not against industry or economic prosperity. We want to work towards a society that cherishes people, the planet, and the economy all at the same time. Now, I'm going to be talking about vulnerable waters today, but this could apply to any of the work that any of you do in any natural resources that we care about. The outline of my talk is I'm going to give a very brief overview of the wetland regulatory framework, from which I'm going to be talking about what's happening with vulnerable waters. I'm going to tell you what vulnerable wetlands are, and talk about watershed scale functions highlighted in a new initiative that grew out of changes in the political environment from a working group that I worked with that was put together by the EPA in Georgia, and identify our current conservation challenges. But given that I am a product also of the Mitchell Center, I'm going to give you an example of a solution of conserving vulnerable waters that is working in Maine towns right now. So we know that ducks are responsible for putting wetlands on the map, literally. They began being mapped when it was realized that duck populations were going down, and the duck basket of the world is a very popular region. But I also am going to be taking a bird's eye view and start broad and talk about vulnerable wetlands in general, and then end the talk with a specific example here in Maine with one type of vulnerable wetland, vernal pools. So what ducks did for us is they recognized what all of you would know is a wetland. You don't need a wetland, of course. Very wet areas with marsh plants, we all recognize these as wetlands. The regulatory environment is that there is a federal regulation through the Clean Water Act that protects wetlands that ducks like. And then over that, a state has a minimum of what the federal leadership is giving us, and they can have stricter wetland regulations. And in the state of Maine, this is run by the Department of Environmental Protection. So there's laws that can be laid over and made more rigorous if the state wishes to. And navigable waters to date have been defined as waters that you can float a duck in, that have ebb and flow, that support interstate commerce. and until recently has significant nexus. Wetlands that have a significant nexus to these open waters, and that could mean they were literally adjacent or neighboring, or some sort of ecosystem processes linked the wetland to that open water area. That's the background, that's the regulatory framework within which we're working. So we recognize this is a wetland and no one has a problem with that. There are coastal wetlands that are covered under this existing definition of navigable waters, and that's because ducks are close enough to walk in them and interstate commerce. Floodplain wetlands are included in navigable waters because they flood and fish swim in them, not necessarily this species. So vulnerable waters or so-called geographically isolated wetlands are non-perennial headwater streams. That means that they don't run all the time. There are wetlands outside of floodplains, which happens to include wetlands that are important to me. That would be the vernal pools or the seasonal wetlands. And good examples of these, as I've already alluded to, are the prairie poplar region. These occur worldwide, these wetland types. These are ephemeral, temporary, or headwater streams, critically important to downstream areas. Gilgais, these are a seasonal wetland type in arid Australia. Playas, which occur in the United States and globally, they're massive wetlands that you can drive vehicles in that may only flood once every 10 years or once every 5 years. Those are the vulnerable waters. For obvious reasons, you can't necessarily float a duck in them or put your kayak in them. So the current concern is that the federal and state regulations are not currently conserving the functions and values that we associate with these vulnerable waters. There was a very exciting rule in 2015, I'm sure most of you in this audience know about, called the 2015 Clean Water Rule. And for the first time, the Clean Water Act was made to focus on a watershed scale or a regional scale, or think about wetlands and how they interact with the landscape and with those open water bodies. There was special attention given to vulnerable wetlands to make it so that you didn't assess a single wetland in its isolated position, but you actually had to look at what its relationship with other things in the adjacent ecosystems was. Very good switch and change of focus. It gave a broad interpretation of the term navigable waters. You saw that significant nexus. Well, that's sort of a portfolio approach where that Clean Water Rule was leading us towards, where you actually look at the nature of and quality of the wetlands across the landscape and how they interact with each other. So there is this new word of relatively new, of meta-ecosystems, such as vernal pools. There are sets of ecosystems connected by spatial flows of energy, materials, and organisms across ecosystems. And we developed a working group funded by the Environmental Protection Agency to get scientists from all over the East Coast to come and make a case for geographically isolated wetlands not being isolated, and for supporting with the science this landscape scale or meadow ecosystem approach. Little did we know that this was going to disappear. We just had an executive order signed eliminating the Clean Water Rule of 2015 and advocating for Justice Scalia's definition of navigable waters, which is only those that are permanent and flowing. So, on the face of it, a wetland ecologist could be really upset and depressed by this. However, the timing was pretty good because our working group has gotten a whole bunch of papers out talking about how these wetlands are connected. And what I want to do today is go over some of what our approach is to meeting this challenge that we have of not having potentially federal and state regulations, which are setting a standard that will allow for the long-term viability of these resources and all the functions that they perform for us. So why are vulnerable wetlands important? Well, money speaks. People like money. So on this slide, on one of the papers that we've submitted, the valued ecosystem services of the 2.9 million kilometers of headwater streams is, can't read, $16 trillion. Valued ecosystem services down below there of the 6.6 million hectares of wetlands outside of floodplains, $673 billion. And this is calculating ecosystem services, flood control, water quality, and so forth. We all have heard more traditional functions of these wetlands with different hydrologies in terms of enhancing landscapes level biodiversity. But what I'd like to go through now are some of the things that our group was working on as a group with existing data, and we're collecting new data, but actually putting a picture together for why the vulnerable wetlands are not actually geographically isolated, and that's a misnomer. And we look at three things: how these wetlands are connected on the landscape to other resources through hydrology, ecology, and biogeochemistry. And I'm going to use vernal pools as one example. It's only one kind of vulnerable water in the United States. I hope you understand that. These are transferable themes to other sorts of vulnerable waters. So vernal pools, most of you already know, are those wetlands that have temporary hydrology or seasonal hydrology, fill in the spring just about this time of year with snow melt, and they house this very specific to temporary water suite of amphibians and the charismatic crustacean, the fairy shrimp. And we're not going to talk too much about these things because I want to spend more time on the policy issues. Not that I couldn't, but so one of the papers coming out of this group is geographically isolated wetlands are part of the hydrologic landscape. These scientists are sort of working on some of the work that Sean Smith here associated with the Glacial Center is doing, looking at the role of microtopographic depressions at the scale of vernal pool or smaller, their contributing role to headwater streams and local water resources. We also have people at the University of Maine. You know, we worked in the East, but the University of Maine is a fantastic place where we have a lot of students working on some of these cutting-edge issues. Kelly Straka is here today. She's sitting over here, and she works with Andrew Reed, and they're looking at hydrologic characteristics of vernal pools. Biogeochemical functions, not something that's generally on people's lips for a function that's valuable in these so-called geographically isolated wetlands. But the working group actually did a lot of work on some of these functions and scaled it up from pool to pool to look at contributions of vernal pools in the landscape to processing carbon, greenhouse gases, and so forth, and found them to be very significant and with an impact beyond what you would imagine from their size. And we have Lydia Kiffner here. Is she here somewhere? Lydia has a poster, and she's doing work with myself and Aria on biogeochemistry of vernal pools. And they're very productive. Some say they're even as productive as salt marsh. She's looking at carbon dynamics and nitrogen and phosphorus. These pools are tremendous transporters of carbon, feeding terrestrial ecosystems. This is not considered an ecological connection anymore, but I see it as that definition of a meta-ecosystem where you get carbon transported across ecosystem lines and feeding a terrestrial system. So we have that work ongoing at the University of Maine. We have a suite of graduate students looking at the ecology of these pools, and this has been done for decades in the East. We're not the first people at all to do this, but we're following up on that work and trying to make linkages. This is a whole team at Maine working on vernal pools, including Chris Hoffman, who's also sitting here in the front. There she is with pitfall traps. She's working on blue-spotted salamanders, but the thing that we're doing that we hope proves these connections and can help us plan for vernal pools in a landscape that are functioning on every level, not just a wetland level, but the adjacent ecosystem level. She does put radio transmitters on these blue-spotted salamanders, and we're looking at what sorts of terrestrial landscapes They go across every yellow line. You see there is one of her radio transmitted girls. She followed them around all summer. We're trying to see what their post-breeding habitat needs are, what they might be contributing to upland ecosystems, and how they're responding to development in the landscape. We have the same thing going on with a student named Tom Hastings working with wood frogs, and you see the spaghetti lines of all the wood frogs. He's been chasing around the woods in Bangor trying to understand what they use as post-breeding habitat, and he has followed them into hibernation. He will be waiting for them to wake up, and we'll find out where they go when they come out of hibernation. All this information that we're gathering, we're trying to provide towns with as much local level information as possible to do intelligent conservation planning, so that we can better assess how human beings and these amphibians can live together and what everybody's needs are. So the question is, okay, do these things operate on a watershed scale? Are they meta ecosystems? We say yes. We had a paper looking at this called "Do Geographically Isolated Wetlands Influence Landscape Functions?" where we put all of this research together in one paper and came out with a resounding yes. Okay, so now what we have is we have ongoing work, but we have enough foundational work to tell us that these vulnerable waters are indeed integral parts at a much broader scale than a wetland scale. Where the gap is that the federal government and the state government are not necessarily going to be able to conserve those functions in the long run. It takes a long time to learn all these things and to get regulation in place, and it takes a sweep of executive order to take it away. So what do? Well, I think we can do something. So we'll go over some of the challenges and the road to solutions for managing at this scale. Okay? So one of the major challenges is, if you look at this graph, we're going to start up in the upper right corner. There are varying degrees of connectivity of these so-called geographically isolated wetlands. The first one is channel connected. So we're basically talking about different hydrogeomorphic settings. So channel connected, they interact with open water bodies on a frequent, regular level. And that's the type of wetland that may still fall under navigable waters, although it's not permanent, so I'm not sure it will if that executive order goes through. But that's the one that's been the no-brainer significant nexus, and I know all of you consultants who filled out the millions of pages that you have to do to say whether it's adjacent or not, appreciate that. The second level of connectivity is something I can't see, but it's intermittent connectivity. It's a little further from the open water resources, and it may flood once every 100 years, or it may overflow. I know in the case of the Midwest, big rain events, they may connect, but it's not a regular thing. And then the other kind is infrequent connectivity, like a lot of the long poles we work with in Orono, which are on heights of land and are only fed by rainwater. And they never have interactions directly with headwater streams or open water bodies. So that's a challenge. That's part of a portfolio. The problem is that the functions for these three, they're color-coded, so you can check them out. But the functions vary depending on that hydrogeomorphic setting, depending on that level of connectivity. The functions will vary. So if we don't capture this portfolio of functions, we're missing out on the overall integrity of the landscapes that we're trying to conserve. So the other challenge is that we're not talking about just conserving wetlands. We need to start thinking about integrated systems. It's an integration of upland and wetland. If we use amphibians as a model system, they're really great for showing they go to the breeding pools to breed, but 95% of their life history is outside of those breeding pools. They're literally integrators of wetland and terrestrial systems. And they have different post-breeding habitat needs. They have actually different types of hydrology that they use for breeding. And that one system in and of itself is really a perfect model for what we're talking about with vulnerable wetlands being meta ecosystems. So the current regulations do not recognize this portfolio of functions. Okay, we're actually going to be entering a phase where a lot of these are just going to drop out of the picture of regulation. They're nowhere near open water bodies. If they all drop out, I believe that the integrity of our flowing waters and our permanent waters is going to be compromised. It's a big mistake. We have the science now to support this, and the science is still being produced to support this. So let's talk about what we've done in Maine for a portfolio watershed approach. We're going to take both a frog's eye view and a bird's eye view. So we need to think as if you were a frog, what is the environment, or a salamander learning, what's the environment look like to you? And then from a bird's eye level, flying above, what does connectivity on a landscape look like? Even if there aren't channels of water connecting all those things, they're ecologically and biodynamically connected. What does that look like? We can no longer manage wetland by wetland. I wish there weren't even a word wetland regulations. They ought to be natural resource regulations. It helps to compartmentalize things and to make us think in compartments. So I'm going to be sort of a frog's eye view here. There are many different types, for example, of vernal pools. There's extremely temporary vernal pools that have no vegetation and leaf at the bottom. These are great for fairy shrimp and wood frogs. But then there are the floodplain pools, and they are very different. They're adjacent to open water bodies. They support species in the river that you'll never see in other vernal pools, like wood turtles and ribbon snakes and things like that. So they have a completely different function. And then there's vernal pools up north, which are very, some of them are 1 to 2 acres in size, nowhere near open water bodies, the only place in town to breed. If you work in southern and central Maine, you've never seen anything like this. There's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of every species breeding in 1 2-acre pool. So they're not all created equally. They all have different functions. So what have we done to try to conserve vulnerable waters in the state? Well, traditional top-down regulation, we had the Clean Water Act, and vernal pools were mentioned. We have the state regulation we got in 2007. We had regulations for vernal pools put on the books, but it conserved significant vernal pools only, which is less than 20% of all vernal pools. So really not sufficient, and the regulation was based on buffers that are put around riparian areas of 250 feet in a circle. Okay, and that's not, it's not working. It's good. It put them on the map, and it got us discussing vernal pools. It got people mad about vernal pools, and that's good because it's very good to have an angry public when you want to come up with a new solution and sort of have skin in the game. Like, we don't like this regulation. You can all say, yeah, none of us like this regulation. I don't like it. It's not working. They don't like it. So it doesn't work alone, although I think it does have a role. Incidental conservation. It's great. It is part of the portfolio, but it doesn't work to conserve, I almost said bigly. I'm going to say it. It doesn't work to conserve bigly. Okay? Incidental conservation is just one of the tools that we have. Involuntary production, same thing. Incidental, I mean, like if there's a national park and there's pools in it, they're incidentally protected. Okay. So the example of a portfolio approach is something that Liz Hart's also stated here, and I have been working on with the town of Topsom and the town of Orono. I'm going to talk a little bit about that approach. If you want to hear more about this approach in the afternoon session on wetlands, Liz and I will go into much more detail about this. This is just, I'm in the bird's eye view here. So the theory behind it is local ownership of strategies. What a novel idea. We sit down with the people who are being affected and talk to them about how we might do a better job. Local intelligence cannot beat local intelligence in terms of locating natural resources, in terms of testing the waters for who the town might trust to come forward with information, how they want to receive that information. Flexibility. One size doesn't fit all. When you look at federal and state regulations, one size has to fit all. They don't have the personnel to be tailoring regulations to every town. That happens at the local level, and guess what? Towns can have even stricter regulations than federal and state. So since we have home rule and we have lots of opportunity for doing that, flexibility offered at the local level is very attractive. At the local level, we can give attention to socioeconomic realities by town. We're not assuming every town has the same economics and has the same challenges. That's the other beauty of working at the local level. And we can consider a range of temporal and spatial scales. We can actually work at a landscape scale in the town for local level driven conservation of natural resources. So this is what Liz and I have been doing for the last 6.5 years. We have a stakeholder group, and we just published a paper on this. If anyone is interested in how we did this, turning intention into collaboration. Remember I said that 2007 rule about people would be upset. So that was great because people were angry, they hated vernal pools, and when we said we might have another way to do this, they were interested and came to the table. So after 6.5 years of meetings, 60 plus meetings, we worked with the same people, lasted for 6.5 years. We did not rotate through people, believe it or not. We didn't exhaust them, and I didn't beat anyone up. Development community, we had economists and appraisers, biologists, citizens, 2 towns, 7 state and federal agencies, and 2 land trusts. Sat at a table, and yes, it took 6.5 years. But sometimes it takes 6.5 years to get everyone to buy into something and to allow time for the creative solutions to come to the fore. It took Liz 2.5 years to have people trusting each other to open their mouths enough, don't you think? At least, yeah, that's laying the groundwork for 2.5 years. But was it worth it? It's the best thing that I ever did in my career. It was the most challenging, most interesting, and I learned so much from the development and real estate community to help me understand where they were coming from vis-a-vis vernal pools and other natural resources. Vanessa Levesque created this. It's called a sociogram. Isn't it great? That's her dissertation right there. So let me this is just to illustrate to you what this is a pictorial way of representing all the people, the major groups that were at the table. And the size of the square is the more hits you get. But those lines are levels of interactions among the different groups. And you can see that we really created quite a complex web of interactions. Who's talking to who's having separate meetings. And this was all done. Vanessa did massive interviews of all of our stakeholders who, thankfully, after 6 years, were willing to do that and work with the PhD students. That's one thing, people love students. So this was great, just to show you the level of connections among all of us. And the end product after 6.5 years was this vernal pool special area management plan. And this is the first time that the Army Corps has used the special area management plan in the eastern United States. I believe there was one in the western United States. We're the second one that's been run through the Army Corps of Engineers, our very close partners with Ruth Ladd. What a vernal pool special area management plan is, it's another tool. It was accepted into the legislative framework. It's now in our general permit in 2016 in September. It is now available to all states in England to use as a tool. In the special area management plan, we're going to be going into much more detail later this afternoon, but I'll walk you through what the big parts of it are. There's a link to it. I think that Ruth is going to be posting PowerPoint, so if you want to get to that link, you can. So what we did is we took 2 towns that we had a good working rapport with and who trusted us through work we'd done mapping vernal pools. After 2007, the legislation came out we started mapping pools in a systematic way in all of these towns. We chose Orono because its town planner is Evan Rickert, who's a superstar, and it's good to pick your mascots who are well respected and might have influence in the state. Evan is one of those. And Topsom because they're very progressive. They were great partners in the vernal pool mapping. Those are our two model towns that we're going to be testing. We are testing the special area management plan in those two towns. And the general idea, this is bird's eye view, is that you look at the growth areas of a town and you look at the rural zones of a town. And we have all the vernal pools mapped that where we have landowner permission. And the idea is that you get delegated authority, which has never happened. It's an option with our DEP, but this is the first time that it's ever been implemented. Delegated authority gives the town the right to manage certain resources, and the towns will be managing their vernal pool resources, not all wetlands, their vernal pools. That delegated authority allows the developer to come into the growth area, and instead of doing traditional mitigation, they're going to use this alternative mitigation tool, the SAM mechanism. They will pay a certain amount of money based on what their property was worth with and without a vernal pool. We get a percentage of that difference in order to remunerate a landowner in a rural area who wants to put a conservation easement on their poolscape. And we're going to be roughly getting, for development on one pool, we will get 2 pools that have the proper ecologically sound amount of critical terrestrial habitat. And I can't emphasize enough that I don't want to be a very narrow person known as the vernal pool person. When you conserve vernal pool poolscapes, you conserve the flow path for materials and energy and everything else and wildlife. Moose, bear, large mammals, mid-sized mammals, mammals that play on rocks, all of them pass by vernal pools. So when we conserve these poolscapes, we're conserving the wildlife that we love here in the state of Maine, and we're conserving and allowing for ecosystem processes to occur that people don't care about. So it's a win-win situation. We'll go into detail more this afternoon. I'm not going to get into how the growth area works and what part of the growth area we're going to be using. But here's the general concept. In the state rules right now, we have a 250-foot buffer only on significant vernal pools for which you can apply for a permit to develop up to 25% of it. If more than one landowner owns that vernal pool, each one can develop 25% of it. So over the years, since the new administration, it's been chipped away at, and there have been exclusions. And so basically now, I can tell you that vernal pools in the growth zones of towns will not be functioning vernal pools soon. They will be urban wetlands, and they'll have a value as urban wetlands. But they won't be functioning as a very specialized breeding habitat for amphibians. So now what we're talking about is we're getting more land in vernal pools, not a 250-foot buffer. We're getting 2 pools, and we're working with land trusts to do this. And it turns out, like in Topsom, turned out that their targets were our targets. So suddenly we get 2 conservation groups working together and provide seed money and help each other. You have less angry landowners because they're getting remuneration for what they consider something that's getting in the way of their kids' college education. They want to sell that land. So it's a win-win situation in that respect, and it diffuses the hatred of this small wetland. And it's a much better solution because from the beginning we engaged the people that this is affecting. We didn't bring them to the meeting 3 years later and say, okay, developers, we're going to say we have a plan and here's what it is. We asked them, what can you do for us and what do you think? So just to reiterate, town-driven optional mitigation tool. We're testing it now. We don't expect a rash of these things to be going through immediately, but Kathleen Bell, the economist who was working on the project, she's at Maine, being said, eventually this has become a really hot ticket, a tool that people are going to use, and she sees it spreading around the region, which would be very exciting to us. Better conserves swimming pools and local economies, treats swimming pools as part of a portfolio. So in the rural area, we're looking at key areas where there are next to conservation land, or we're getting double, triple, quadruple dipping of conservation values. It meets the mission of the Clean Water Act. With or without the Clean Water Act, that's the beauty of it. We can keep on going, and it actually makes the local people feel more invested in their futures and more a part of a sense of place of where they live, probably waking people up and getting them to participate locally. And that's it. I want to thank all of my colleagues. None of this would be done without all this long list of people. The graduate students are the power behind all the science, and their dedication and enthusiasm and creativity has made all this possible. Funding, National Science Foundation Center for Sustainability Solutions, my own department have been key in carrying this work forward. We have a webpage of Pools and People, and on that webpage we have a tab for the new towns that we're working with. It hasn't been populated yet, but if you want to follow the progress of the Special Area Management Plan, it is going to be featured on our webpage, which already has a bunch of stuff that people can use. One of the things that we're working a lot more with is outreach, and we have a student, Laura Bowler, in our department who is creating a comic book series on vernal pools that's going to be posted on our webpage. It's just a sample of her artwork, which is absolutely amazing. There's more out front and a poster out front. And I think we have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you. We can turn the lights on now. I'm not afraid to be not anonymous now. There's a question over here.
I have the microphone though.
Is that Audrey?
Yes.
I recognize your voice, so there you are.
Aram, great talk. I wondered what greatest challenge was you faced in doing that meeting, like those 6.5 years with all of this mix of stakeholders and land trusts and landowners.
So the greatest challenge was, and I know that Liz feels this way too, every meeting for the first 2 years, I thought could very well be the last one. Okay, for 2 years. I thought it could easily dissolve because there are different personalities, and a lot of personalities are, if it isn't easy, they just keep coming up with the roadblocks. Well, we can't do that because we'd never be able to get blah, blah, blah. And so I lied the first 2 years and said, I did. The optimism, the first part on the slide from the Financial Center, is the way to get things done. So I said, okay, that'll be all right, we'll work that out. It was always cheerful, yeah, we can do that. And then, the thing that I did is I got, not divide and conquer, but divide and come up with solutions. So the biologists would argue among themselves. I didn't want to air all the roadblocks in for the whole group who would get demoralized. So the biologists would go by themselves, and the developers and various groups met alone, and then we'd come back with the consensus so that they didn't have to see the messy sausage meeting with IPW, not agreeing with DEP. I had to split your USGS, I had to split the feds from the state so they could complain about each other. Seriously, and then we got them back together when we found a common ground. So my greatest fear in the beginning is that the whole thing's going to fall apart. But if you just smile and say, no, it'll be all right. Not for your team, and it was. It worked. Trump is right, lying works. Yes. David, I've lost track of where microphones are.
Dave's got one.
So given that like the Clean Water Act has obviously been removed and like the EPA's kind of on its way out under Trump's administration, now they say that the funding is supposed to be out by 2018. How do you expect things to change if we don't have these regulations in place?
So the Clean Water Act won't disappear, okay? Some things are being weakened. And I think that was the point, is I think that well, first of all, I'm very impressed with how democracy works in general, okay? It's great. A dictator can't be a dictator in this country. I'm very impressed with that, and I didn't think that I would be heartened to learn that the hard way. By the same token, you young people need to take heart that you can't rip everything apart all at once. It's not going to happen. You will survive this, but I do believe that the way to survive it in the short term is to be involved locally and to do this sort of work. And I think that if you young people start paying attention to local government, start not taking for granted that you're always going to have clean water and clean air, and that the wetlands are always going to be there. No one's taking care of that for you. So I have seen in my own lab and working with superstar undergraduates that you have a tremendous amount of creativity and energy and dedication in your generation. And I'm looking for them to carry the torch. And do not be demoralized. This has been a great test and it's woken all of us up. And you now have a serious job to do with all the people in this room. Look at this. This is the Water Resources Conference. Look at all the people who are doing good work and keep doing it. You can't beat all these people. You just can't. And that's why I'm saying federal and state regulations provide standards for us. We can provide our own standards. And we're going to have to. And not be depressed about it. I'm not lying. Somebody back here? You know, I'm standing up here and they still ask me if I wanted a stool. Do you think that's nice? I mean, I'm up here and they still ask you on a stool. That's bad. Anyway.
Yeah, so you talked about how public anger can be really useful. And you also talked about how getting everyone in the same room to talk was how you got this done. And I've been thinking recently a lot about how anger prevents people from coming into the same room and talking to each other. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that context.
So the good thing is you don't need everybody who's angry. You need, when we chose, Liz and I chose our stakeholder group, we thought carefully about getting folks who had respect and influence because it would spread out. So there's going to be, I think people need to know that you've got the right and the left, and then you've got the people in the middle. It's the people, the angry people in the middle who you tip either way. That's your best bet. You're not going to move people on the far extremes of any ideology. So you focus on the middle, and the angry people in the middle who actually see a benefit in solving the problem are the ones that are going to come to the table. So you can't reach everybody. So you pick personality and you pick carefully. And sometimes you make mistakes. That's why it takes 6.5 years. Does that answer your question? I mean, you can't reach everybody. And that's why people ask, well, why are you choosing Thompson and Warner? Why don't you go up north or down east where I live? It's because they don't want us. Why start working where it's hard to work? Why not pick something where it's going to work and you can set a model and an example that does work and then let that speak to the people on the extremes to say, look, that's interesting. Thompson and Warner didn't fall apart. They actually got stronger. But that's it for you.
Time for one last question.
So you spoke a fair bit about the watershed portfolio approach,
Yeah.
and thinking about how all of these different parts of the hydrologic cycle interact with each other. Can you speak a little bit about how you found applying that approach fit with, the relatively small-scale approach of going to a town, where your administrative boundaries don't match up with your hydrologic boundaries?
Yep, great question. We're starting with we call them poolscapes in the rural area, where you map out all the pools and you identify the ones that have a high conservation value. And it is only at the town level, but in Thompson, we're working with the, I was going to say BTLT, Brunswick Thompson Land Trust. And we have built into the special area management plan that areas where we do the conservation can be outside of the town in something like a BTLT, where there's a land trust that has a broader scale. And our whole idea over the long term, it's a great question, is to go beyond town boundaries. But the one thing that you have to do is take baby steps. Let's show that it works in a town, and then we're talking about getting contiguous towns involved and potentially even a regional approach. So that's an overarching goal down the road, and that was a great question.
Listening to Aram's discussion of her work with lizards in the 6.5 years, I had the privilege of working with Senator Mitchell, and so I had an opportunity to learn a little bit about his remarkable life and work. One of the things he says in one of his writings about the peace process in Northern Ireland, which needless to say wasn't an easy haul either, was he talked over the period of 4 or so years that he went back and forth from the U.S. to Northern Ireland. He talked about making 300 trips, 299 of which were failures. And the point about optimism, and he didn't use the word lying through your teeth, but he did talk about this sense of optimism, and I can't do the exact quote, it's not in the book, but in a speech he gave 10 years after the Good Friday Peace Accord. Oh, yes, thank you. I'll do that in a second. He said, this is the task of political leadership, to project a sense of optimism without being naive or unduly realistic. So I think that balancing act is everywhere in this work, and all of us, I think, have an opportunity to get better at it. Ron, I've got to call you back here because I have something for you that I forgot to give you. So come on. So if you did already get the idea that Aram is pretty passionate about the natural world, you must have not been here for the last few minutes. Aram doesn't just love being out kayaking or keeping an eye on frogs, but she's also a great gardener. So we have this gift for her. Yeah, for her. Yeah. So, and once she gets done with her garden, get over to mine. It's all that matters. Thanks, Steve. One more thing to do before lunch. We're actually pretty much on time. We're going to do awards for the poster presentations today, and I'm calling up my colleague Linda Silva, who's a senior fellow in the Mitchell Center of Social and Community Psychologist. Used to be the director of the Aram J. Smith Center at the University of Maine, and a wonderful friend. And Bob Lent from the U.S. Geological Survey, who's been a partner for this conference for many, many years. So, hand it over to them.
So before we have the pleasure of announcing the awards, I just want to say again, what an amazing person Aram is. And she's really, although she might not describe herself this way, she's really a major policy leader in the state. And I had the pleasure recently of interviewing her for a column that's in Maine Policy Review that you can read online, where 4 of the most eminent policy leaders in the state were interviewed about looking back, looking forward, so that we could all take advantage of their experience over decades, helping us think about where we've been as a state and where we're going. And Aram was one of the key people who was interviewed, so it was great. So we're now, one of the wonderful things of the many things about this conference is the poster session where we get to see the great work that students are doing and the exciting ways that they're thinking about the science and policy in these areas. And as we were all walking around talking to the students, one of the things I tried to do was to ask the students, so are you getting some good questions from the people here? And what's your next step? And it was amazing to hear them report on the questions that they were getting from you and how they were thinking about them. And also sort of what they see as their next step. And they really have exciting plans for continuing the research, continuing the policy, learning more. So it's really just wonderful to hear what's going on and to see the future. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start with the high school students. First we'll mention the honorable mention and then the first place. And we'll ask that the students come up here and stay up here so that we can take a picture or two of them. Not everyone was able to be here. We wish everyone could be and could have stayed, but you know, it's funny. They're students, and sometimes they have to leave and go to things. So we will call everybody's name, even if they aren't able to still be here. And they probably had to leave hungry because they didn't get to have lunch. So first, for the high school, honorable mention, Alice Wang and Annalise Nichols, and they are here from Bangor High School. For first place in high school, it's Alexander Marara from Old Town High School. Undergraduate, honorable mention, Tyler Allen, Leah Maria, Olivia Marable, and Nupa from St. Joseph's College. First place at the undergraduate level, Olivia Conrad from University of Maine. At the graduate level, honorable mention, Kristen Brayton from University of Maine. And at the graduate level, first place is Matt Van Buren from Georgetown University. Wonderful learning, watching what they're doing, looking at their posters, and I think we're all very fortunate to have them here. So let's give them another hand. Congratulations.